Hello and welcome back to the Exchange. Today's topic, the Obama Doctrine, Prudent or Pathetic? I have with me here Andrew Hicks and Elliot Parisi. We'll give these guys a chance to introduce themselves. I'm Ben Peterson. I'm a graduate student at the Texas A&M Political Science Department. Andrew, how about you go first?
Okay, yeah, I'm Andrew Hicks. I'm a graduate of Oklahoma Christian University and Oklahoma State University. I'm a former Peace Corps volunteer in Tanzania, and I currently work in East Africa with a microfinance institution.
All right, Elliot?
I'm Elliot. I'm a former graduate of George Fox University and Pepperdine University, and right now I work for a think tank in the San Francisco Bay Area.
All right, so we're talking about the Obama foreign policy doctrine. We're a bit late to the party. Back in April, there was a pretty long article released by Jeffrey Goldberg in the Atlantic Monthly, and there was a lot of chatter about it. But so that's kind of formed the base of our conversation here. The first question I have for each of you guys, I'd like you to give your response to is there an Obama doctrine? And if so, what is it? Let me give you sort of a contrast here. This is Jimmy Carter from the State of the Union in January 1980, and he says announcing what he called the Carter, or what's been called the Carter Doctrine. Let our position be absolutely clear. An attempt by any outside force to gain control of the Persian Gulf region will be regarded as an assault on the vital interests of the United States of America, and such an assault will be repelled by any means necessary, including military force. But I kind of confess I read that whole Goldberg article that I still couldn't quite tell you exactly what the Obama doctrine is, what Obama will actually do. Got a lot of things he wouldn't do, but Andrew, I'm going to turn it over to you first. Is there an Obama doctrine, and if so, what would you say it is?
Well, is there an Obama doctrine? I would say maybe. I think that there's more of a style or a common kind of strategy with how the Obama White House approaches major foreign policy events, initiatives, decisions, etc. And I think that is it can be characterized in a number of ways. And I'd say one of those things is kind of the rejection of the traditional foreign policy playbook. And I think that was a theme in the Atlantic article. Yeah, a rejection of kind of the traditional foreign policy playbook in exchange for kind of maybe careful calculation of the options on the table. Obama has been described as by some as a realist or a pragmatist maybe, and I think that maybe a practical or realistic approach to some of these major decisions often won the day in the Obama White House. And I don't know. I guess we could talk about some examples of that. But is there an Obama foreign policy doctrine that says if you do X, we know that President Obama will do Y? No, I think the answer to that question is no, and I think that's because looking at all the options on the table and trying to make the best decision possible is kind of the approach, obviously with varying levels of success.
Nice.
Yeah.
What do you think?
We can expound on that, but yeah.
Yeah. What do you think, Elliot?
I think that I kind of agree with Andrew, but I do think there is an Obama doctrine. I think he's defining it now. I think he has a long-term goal of moving American interests from the Middle East to Asia. I think that definitely plays into his overall long-term foreign policy goals, and I do believe that is part of his Obama doctrine. I think he doesn't know how to apply that philosophy to everyday events. So like Syria and Libya, each country has completely two different wars going on, two different. It affects the United States and its Western allies in two different ways, and he responds in two opposite ways that I would think are helpful to those areas. So it seems like he's kind of haphazard in his policies in the Middle East, but he has an overall goal of shifting American troops and American interest and American attention to Asia and away from the Middle East. So it's a long-term goal, but it's a long-term doctrine, I would say. But I don't think he has done it. He knows what to do step by step, I would say.
All right, so yeah, you kind of already started this, Elliot, but let's start with a little bit of a little judgment. Yeah, I think one of with what you identified, Elliot, long term, the pivot to Asia, and with that kind of that I think a lot of things go along with that. The Iran deal, which allows us to kind of sort of step back from antagonism with Iran, not getting involved in Syria. Just today or yesterday, the administration announced sort of more of a partnership with Russia, meaning Assad stays. We're not going to try and get involved and manage Syria. Let's start judging. What do you think he's right that basically we need to try and disengage from the Middle East and pivot over to Asia and also worry about other things like climate change, things like that? I'll kick it back over to you, Andrew.
Yeah. So I think that I think we have to be careful not to characterize this as disengaging from the Middle East. I think that the way that we're kind of phrasing it might lead you to believe that we're saying, well, like, oh, we need to move away from the Middle East. We need to stop worrying about this stuff and pay less attention to it because we're pivoting to Asia. I don't think that's the case. I think the pivot to Asia is a long term. It's the long game. President Obama is looking at the long game, and he's saying something like half the world's population lives in Asia. China has been exerting its influence on the region, and for a number of reasons, we want to be more influential in Asia, in these countries that are coming up in the world. And I think it'd be wrong to characterize to think that maybe that's distracting us from the Middle East. Now, if you look at Syria, for example, you brought up the idea that we're partnering with Russia. We're kind of Assad's going to stay. All these things. I don't know what people would have hoped for us to do. Did anyone really want us to topple Syria, to go in and have another Afghanistan or Iraq type war? I don't think anyone wanted that, and I don't think that would have been good for us or for the environment there in the region. And so, yeah, that's kind of how I view it. I don't know if we want to talk more about the Asia pivot, or where we want to go from here.
Well, Elliot, do you want to give a response?
Yeah, I definitely didn't mean to imply that Obama doesn't care about what happens in the Middle East. I think he does, but I think he believes that America has spent too much time and money and blood in the Middle East, and that I think what I've got from the Goldberg piece is that once Iran doesn't have the nuclear bomb, he kind of sees the Middle East as an area where Iran and Saudi Arabia can kind of hash out their geopolitical interests, and America isn't threatened by Iran doing that because they don't have the nuclear bomb. And so I would think that I think he kind of thinks as the Middle East as not as it's important, but I think he sees it as Asia being more important, and Syria is a mess, and he doesn't want to get into Syria. I don't, and I agree with you. I don't think anybody wants another Iraq war, but I think he could have done more. I think he could have supported the moderate rebels more, and I think having a red line and backing away from it hurt Americans' stance in the world, and it made us look unserious, and it made Obama, I think, look like he was reacting and not acting to events. And his goal in Libya was to stop a dictator from killing its people, which is a noble goal. But he also he also says using force has to be in national interest, and Libya really wasn't in our national interest, whereas using force or maybe just supporting our troops more in Syria is in our national interest. They're an ally of Iran, and they're an enemy of Israel and the Arab states like Saudi Arabia and Jordan. So I think they were a destabilizing force in that Obama could have done more and should have done more in Syria and not got involved in Libya.
Andrew, I want to give you a chance to respond if you want. I do want to inject one other. I think the big contrast to President Obama on the Syria question is Senator Marco Rubio, who's probably the most capable spokesman from kind of the Republicans on foreign policy issues. And I think his approach to the Syria situation is that Assad is the root of the instability, because currently what you've got is, if you're an Arab tribesman or something like that, Sunni Arab, then your choices are between ISIS and Assad, and you don't like Assad. He's part of the Alawite family and all these things like that, and he's got a very oppressive regime. So Assad's the problem. Assad needs to go, or at least to be hemmed in. He suggested things. I don't think I think you're right, Andrew, that he hasn't suggested like massive ground troops or another Iraq. But I think he and like Senator McCain have been more open to something like they wanted to see like no-fly zone or some kind of safety corridor, things like that, explicitly countering the Assad regime. So I don't know if you guys want to talk more about this. I have other questions. We can keep going. Andrew, do you want to give any response to any of that, or keep going?
Yeah. I want to kind of revisit some of the things that Elliot talked about, and if I can scoot back that far and maybe talk about some of the things that you just mentioned, the other options that are out there with how to move forward in Syria. And I think first I want to say I do agree with you on Libya. That was kind of outside of the stated kind of, is this a direct threat to the United States, and if so, we'll respond. And so I do agree with you on Libya. And in Syria, I think you mentioned the red line, and this was a huge topic in the article, the Goldberg article. And I think some questions have to be asked. Maybe we can say that President Obama came out and kind of drew this red line, and a lot of people say maybe he wasn't ready to enforce it. I don't think that was the case. I think that maybe he drew this line too quickly. But I think when it really came down to it, the decision that he made not to go in and strike Syria, I think, in my opinion, was the right decision, because there are a lot of things. So what would that have done? Would that have would bombing Syria have immediately removed Assad from power? Would it have easily secured the eventual removal of the chemical weapons that were there? Would it have stopped the rise of ISIS? These are the kind of questions that have to be considered. And I think that each of those individually, I think it going in and striking in Syria when we said we were going to potentially could have helped those things, but we had no certainty that doing that would not have made the situation worse on the ground. Would we now be facing ISIS, and ISIS that was equipped with chemical weapons? We can't say for sure. Would Assad still be in power? Would he be emboldened by a United States that came in and attacked some equipment that's used to deliver chemical weapons and then not followed up on that? Would we have then forced ourselves into a corner to where we had to take it to the next step? And I think those were the concerns that led to him backing away from that and ultimately taking a different strategic path. And so when we say that drawing this red line and then backing away from it hurts the credibility of the United States, on a very surface level I think it does, but ultimately what happened? We achieved the removal of those chemical weapons. Assad will not be using chemical weapons on his people again. And we did that without having to topple a regime. We did that without having to go into a new war that, and like we all agreed on, no one in the United States wanted another war. So was it the perfect solution? No. But I think that this falls in line with kind of the calculated thinking that is characteristic of the Obama administration. So, and then I think you mentioned a few things, like Senator Rubio and McCain have put out some different proposals on how to move forward. And I don't know. I agree, Assad is a big problem, and I think that you make an interesting point that right now people are basically choosing between Assad and ISIS, and that's a huge issue. But I don't know how we can affect regime change there, how we could get rid of Assad, other than going through the diplomatic kind of channels that we are. I don't see a great way to do that. So if you guys have ideas of how that would actually work, I would love to talk about that.
Yeah, I guess I would say that right now there isn't a great way. I personally think Assad is better than ISIS, and so I think staying out of Syria may be the best thing to do right now. But I think when Obama was talking about red lines during that time, there was an opportunity to support moderate rebels, and I think he let that opportunity go. And I do think, I guess I disagree with you. I do think having a red line and then not following through, I think that does hurt credibility. I think it's not just one thing, but I think it made Obama not weak or unserious, but it just made him look like he was always reacting, and so he's not doing any. It doesn't seem like he's doing things at a position of strength in Syria. It's always reacting to events, and but I do agree with you. I think it's too late to really do anything about Assad and ISIS, and I concede the point that we did take chemical weapons away without attacking Assad, and I think that was a good point, and I do agree with that. And so, but I just think he missed an opportunity from the beginning. There was a real opportunity with the rebel moderates, and they're not moderates how Americans see as moderates. I understand that, but they're moderate compared to Assad, and they're moderate compared to ISIS, and so I think we should have taken that opportunity.
Okay, sure, yeah, and I see your point that we missed a big opportunity in the beginning to kind of I don't know, not necessarily nip it in the bud, but to pick a side, right, and to support a side. And I think that
Assad,
probably
right?
was
Not Assad.
a side, not Assad. Yeah.
Maybe
No,
the Assad side.
to pick a side, yeah. So yeah, that is a good point, and you did mention they're not the moderates as we think of here in the United States, yeah, I think that's a great point, that we kind of missed the boat on that. So now where do we go from here, right? That's the big ask.
And I think I agree with you. From here, I think we can't really do a whole lot. So I do think I think where we disagree is from the beginning, but I agree with you what to do with Syria now. I think it might be too late.
So y'all both agree we just got to team up with Russia now, like we're doing?
Yeah. So I hesitate to call it teaming up with Russia, right? But I think that is a good way to approach it, and I think that's our diplomatic channel that we have available to us, and we need to take advantage of that, even if we, it's maybe a hard pill to swallow to say that we're teaming up with Russia on this thing, but we've got to do something, and as Elliot said, we're kind of too late to do some of the things that I guess a lot of people think we should have done in the beginning,
Right. Okay, I want to go to a different kind of topic. There was a quote that I found really fascinating. I may not get it exactly right in the Goldberg article, the Atlantic article, and it says something like, Goldberg keeps asking questions, trying to get at what's the core of your thinking on foreign policy, President Obama? What drives you? And in particular related to ISIS, a lot of people there have been airstrikes. You know, the U.S. has been, and they've got advisors. We've got advisors in Iraq and I think in some cases in Jordan and things like that. But there hasn't been, you know, definitely not a major ground force. And there's a lot of people saying, why aren't we doing more? And President Obama's response is something like, well, ISIS is not an existential threat to the United States. However, global climate change is a potentially existential threat to the whole world if we don't do something about it. So I was just curious, in other words, do you think President's right? Is that the right way to think about foreign policy? He's got to think about these long terms, and maybe we can also go back to Asia, like you guys both brought up, to think about these long term. We need to figure out a pivot to Asia. We need to develop our markets there, and we need to develop a posture there. We need to think about global climate change. So he did the Paris Accords, I think, he participated in November, December. But what about the urgent threats? Or is the president's job more to deal with the urgent threats? That's kind of my question. Elliot, why don't you start on this one?
So is the question, what's the president's job, the urgent threats or long term?
Yeah, that's a good short way to ask it. What's the president's job in terms of that?
Well, it's an awful job because it's both. He has to deal with urgent and long term. My opinion is that ISIS is not a threat as like a nuclear Iran would be a threat, or Iran right now. I don't think it's as big of a threat as Iran, but I think it's a bigger threat than global climate change. I think global climate change is kind of. I understand that it's important. I don't know if it's more important than trying to stabilize the Middle East and trying to shift our attention to Asia. I would have to say that it's not. I think global warming. I think scientists agree that it is happening, but I think where the disagreement is how much how much do we affect it, and how bad is it going to be in the long run? And so I think that's uncertain. And if it is a problem, and if it does show to be worse for us in the long run, then I think the president should take a more active role in it. But right now, it doesn't seem like that's the most pressing foreign policy concern for us. I think ISIS is a concern. I think. I don't think, like I said, I don't think it's the main concern. I think Iran is a bigger concern than ISIS, and I think the rise of China is a bigger concern than ISIS. So I think he needs to think long term, but he has to think short term as well. It's a difficult job, and so, but that's why he has it.
All right.
Yeah. Elliot's right. It is a very difficult job, and you do have to look at urgent threats and long-term things also. And I think there's a quote in the article from the president. He says you have to be able to, I'm paraphrasing, but distinguish between all of the urgent things and the truly important things. And I think the truly important things, the urgent, of all those urgent things, ISIS is up there. And so if the question is climate change, which should you prioritize, climate change or ISIS? That's a tough ask. I don't think we want to get into a debate about climate change, but I think I will say that if you believe that climate change is an existential threat to humanity, then yes, it is a more significant issue than ISIS. And if you and I think the president believes that, and I think that a lot of people around the world believe that. And there's another good point that the president, I don't know if it's the president or the author of the article brings up. They say that climate change is one of these things it's relatively slow moving. It affects the entire world, and so it needs action from leaders all over the world. And so it's something that we need to address now. We need to be putting energies into now, because to make even a small amount of change, even to have a small amount of, even to make a small amount of progress on an issue like climate change, it takes a long time. It's a huge effort. And so I think that he's correct to be focusing some energies on that. And I think that this is another, maybe he poorly phrased or maybe was deflecting from a question, but I don't think that climate change is distracting the president from addressing ISIS. I don't think that the Paris climate talks were taking away from our response to ISIS. Does that make sense? But I do think that, so expounding a little bit on climate change, why is it such a threat? In the immediate term, we can look at different examples. We can say significant weather events do have effect on the current environment. So an example, using Syria as an example, a lot of people point to a drought that occurred in Syria between 2006 and 2009, and they said that this drought, which was brought about, or at least the severity of this drought was increased by anthropogenic climate change. This drought then led to poor agricultural incomes all over the country. It led to millions of people fleeing from rural areas to urban areas, and then eventually contributed to the uprising in Syria. And I think this is this is obviously theory, and there are obviously a lot of other things going on in Syria at the time, but I think this is a very good example of how climate change can be a real threat to us today, and why we should be paying attention to it, not just looking at the long-term consequences of completely ignoring it. Does that make sense? That's
that makes sense. I guess I would say, because it's slow moving, what we do with climate change should be incremental. And the science on climate change isn't that deep. The Earth is older than 150 years, and that seems like how much we've tracked climate change. And so I say that to say that we don't have the full data yet, and I do believe that we do affect the climate, and humans affect the climate. I think that's pretty common sense. But we don't know how much we affect it, and so I would say that we need to be careful in what we do, in our implementation. That I don't think we need to rush to change things, is what I'm saying. If we have a problem, we should work on it, but it should be slow because the problem is slow. It doesn't need to be rushed because of the problem, because the problem isn't rushed. And I don't discount that the drought in Syria probably had a role to play in the uprising. I just hesitate to say that's a direct result of climate change or not, because there have been droughts before, and I don't know if we have the science to say, are we having more droughts in the past 100 years than they've had 300 years ago? I don't know that. Maybe there are more droughts, but I think climate change is slow moving, and so I just repeat what I said, is slow moving, and so what we do with it should also be slow moving.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I agree that incremental change is definitely the best way to approach it, especially in the current environment where maybe not everyone agrees on it, right? But I think that something just to add to that, not to I don't think we want to go down this rabbit hole, right? But so having a president that acknowledges that this is a problem or a potential threat, that puts some energies into it, I think is a great way for the United States to potentially lead the world in fighting climate change. And I think that we should be leading the world in that. And I think, like you brought up, we don't have all the data. The science is evolving on it. What we should be investing in further research and better understanding of climate change and how we affect it, and the things that we can do to bring about that incremental change. And I think that's why it is a major foreign policy focus, at least a stated major foreign policy focus of the president.
All right, and if you do want to go down that rabbit hole, just a quick plug for our other discussion we had on how should we think about climate change. So make sure to catch that earlier episode. Let me ask you guys one more question. I'm hoping this is kind of a little bit provocative. So there's a couple sections there's one section in the Goldberg Atlantic article where, in fact, President Obama admits he says one of the things he kind of may have done, he could have done a little better, is showing a little bit more emotion. We've had, in the aftermath of some of the recent terrorist attacks we've seen, we're actually talking just after the recent attack in Istanbul. But before that, and so the article was written after the attacks in Paris late last year in November, and President Obama speaking in the Philippines after that kind of is hesitant to bring it up, and then gets frustrated. And in the article, even Goldberg mentions he seems to show the most energy when he's talking about he's frustrated with governors in the United States who don't want to admit Syrian refugees. That's where you get the real emotion, as opposed to, and there's a lot of people saying, well, why aren't you showing that much anger and emotion against terrorist attacks and understanding the fear Americans are feeling? So my proposition that I want to pose to you is our last question for you. Proposition for debate. That weakness that even President Obama admits is part of why we have Trump. In other words, Americans feel that the current leadership doesn't understand their issues, their concerns, and he cares more about global leadership and things like that than what do Americans want. Andrew, I'm going to go to you first. What do you think about
that? I disagree with the idea that President Obama's demeanor in the face of some of these tragedies that we've seen over the years had any significant contribution to the rise of a Trump candidacy. I think the ineffective government on both sides of the aisle at the congressional level had led to this. I think that the Republican Party's kind of strategy of demonizing the president and policies on the other side of the aisle without ever really doing anything to help the people who voted them in the office, I think, contributed to this. I think things like the Citizens United decision, which kind of brought to the forefront, made it kind of household level knowledge who really has influence in politics. I think these things contributed to the rise of Trump. And I think that the little bit maybe that you could blame on President Obama's demeanor or his foreign policy strategy, I think that if you presented this to the president and said, look, this contributed X amount to Trump's rise, would you like to go back in time and change something? I think he would say no. But I think if you presented that to the Republican Party and said, hey, look at the result, would you like to go back in time and change some things? They'd say, yeah, we should go back and make some changes to prevent this from happening. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess I would respond that as with the red line issue, I think perception matters. And obviously Obama cares about these people that die in terrorist attacks. I don't doubt that. But it plays into the hand that he's aloof and that he's not taking it seriously. I believe he does take it seriously, but I believe the image of him not taking it seriously feeds a Trump candidacy. I don't think that's the only thing that feeds it. You hit on some other points that feed it, but and I think you can see that by the way Trump talks. When he does make sense, he's all about winning and being strong and making America great, and I think that is in part because of Republican failure, but also in part because Obama, some Republicans, especially Trump supporters, would say Obama has been weak and he's been distant, and he doesn't seem to care when terrorist attacks happen. And like I said, I do think he does care, but I think it plays into that hand, and so I think perception matters, and I guess we disagree on how much perception matters.
It kind of does. Sorry.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Andrew.
yeah, no, and I agree with you that perception definitely matters. I think perhaps we disagree on the amount that on exactly how that has led to specifically Donald Trump's rise. And I think you're right that yeah, no one, most people wouldn't doubt that President Obama cares about the victims of these different terrorist attacks, and he probably could have done better as the leader of the United States in expressing that, and the way his demeanor and his kind of aloofness definitely negatively affected people's perception of him. I think what we disagree on is how much. I think if that contributed to Trump's rise, I think it's a very small amount. But I also acknowledge that I have absolutely no data on that or anything that I'm basing that on other than kind of my perception of the situation. So yeah.
Okay, I think we're gonna wrap up, but I want to give you guys each chance. Any last thoughts?
Elliot, go for it.
Um, no. Last thoughts on what? Obama's foreign policy, or?
Yeah. Yeah. Anything we talked about? Any important areas you think that didn't get talked about that should be?
Yeah. I guess I think Eastern Europe, what's happening in Ukraine, is really important. And it surprised me in that Goldberg piece. Obama was basically like this isn't America's role at all, like a interest at all. That and I think he's worried, rightly worried, that if you do something, we're going to get embroiled in a war. And like we talked about, we don't want another Iraq war. But I think he thinks that even if he supports the Western Ukrainians financially or even with military weapons, that somehow will ultimately lead to us being involved militarily, I think is not right. And so I think he is missing another opportunity to support pro-Western Ukrainians in Eastern Europe, and is allowing Russia to destabilize Eastern Ukraine. And I think we should be doing more, and I don't think Obama would say that. I think he sees it as not American interest, or it's not American interest.
Okay, yeah, great point to bring up, and I think that perhaps that is born out of extreme caution and not wanting to get embroiled in some other conflict in some other region. I guess history time will tell if that is another missed opportunity, like you mentioned in Syria. So yeah, I agree that is an important point to bring up, and I think that it's been dismissed a little bit by saying, well, look, people are the way it's characterized sometimes is, well, Russia is flexing its muscles, it's exerting its influence. And I think that the way the president views it is that, well, that's not really a big deal because Russia is no longer this big, no longer this global superpower that it once was. And I think that's his perspective on it. But you may very well be right that this is something that we'll come to regret, not supporting these people at the expense of being basically in the name of being very cautious and trying to avoid conflicts that maybe we feel like don't directly impact us. So, yeah.
All right. Thanks, Andrew. Yeah. Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, Elliot. And thank you for watching The Exchange. Tune in next week. And feel free to email us if you have topics you'd like to see discussed or if you'd like to participate on The Exchange. Thanks, and we'll see you next week.